is a Tuesday evening in late August. She wanders through various streets linked to a canal that divides the district in two halves. Her thoughts are diffuse and further interrupted by looking at her phone relentlessly, even though she assures herself every time that in fact, not much is happening to afford such habitual discipline. She continues swiping, perpetually loyal. The physical and mechanical repetitions of the day had left her mind somewhat absent. As stained glass, the physical world outside impressed only as schemes and soft outlines. Her inner voice was howling at a distance. Somewhere, raucous noise lodging no meaning. Traffic signal intervals lead her through two-lane streets with pauses on traffic islands. The crossing is repeated 3 times, seems unnecessarily long, and quietly alters her slumbering pace. She recalls a scene about a year ago, when she had met a friend for coffee on the street parallel to the one she was on, a few blocks to the south. She remembered her friend was afflicted about a meeting with her partner on the other side of town. Mirroring the tension, their conversations ran in and out of focus. Her friend's attention further undercut by answering text messages alongside. Soon the mobile phone's battery had run its course, and somewhat relieved, her friend turned back into the conversation as subjects took greater shape. As there was more to say than 1 or 2 coffees could outlast, they began to meander around the neighbourhood in incongruent paths. Seemingly unconscious of her orientation, she was curating the route, avoiding to run the same streets twice while maintaining the direction of a metro station. Pointedly, it was as if she was prolonging the conversation step by step, all the while keeping a potential departure within reach. One of these streets ended on the west end of a cemetery opposite to a financial administration building, allowing them to oversee a high street where quarters thinned, leading into more cleft areas, broader streets, and infrastructure. Housing complexes with hermetic surface devoid of people enlivening the zone. Perhaps such alleged enlivening takes place in backyards or on the insides of the building. She remembered briefly imagining a radial concentric shift of streets running up to a specific centre, though several axes exposed instead an interweaving of roads, such lines of course causing her imaginary assumption to have run astray. Stepping down a stone stair into the cemetery yard that lies a step below the street level, they approached the back of a small stone house like that of a groundskeeper. Brightly painted flower pots and children's drawings fitted to the glass windows made the two feel rather intrusive until, directly behind the house, tombstones appeared, somehow dispelling the private sensibility to the house's objects. They decided to sit on a bench near the entrance. As they continued their conversation, a man entered in and out of the scene. He was an elderly man with thin grey locks, wearing 3/4 length check shorts, and strange, she thought, white socks and sandals. While his face appeared demure, his feet seemed to express a certain unease. The man appeared to assume they were waiting for him. His voice was peculiarly soft, which made the two stand up and move towards him in order to hear him. He continued to walk on, so they followed him about 25 steps or so, where, just around a corner, 6 or 7 people were loosely standing around. The man briefly spoke to those assembled, including them. This meeting, by chance, suddenly felt arranged, as it was now understood the man was a cemetery guide. Though they still felt slightly uncomfortable, the guide managed to draw them into the group, and now they were embarking on a tour of the cemetery. The group moved swiftly down a pebble path framed by trees and approached a crypt near a passage that cut its way through one of the many walls that ordered the cemetery. As though staged, a heavy wind swept in as the sun disappeared behind a thicket of clouds. The tour did not follow a clear order, jumping between decades and centuries even, as graves were of course not aligned in chronological order. Pondering aloud, the guide spoke to the different stages of the cemetery's development, tracing the stories of Jewish and Lutheran creatives from the 18th century, a few humanist scientists, a son of Mendelssohn who'd founded the town's first and lasting photo company. Lingering in her memory of that summer's day's events a bit longer, she crosses the street and catches a glimpse of the setting sun disappearing behind a wall in the west that leads her eyes to the gate of the cemetery. She moves closer and notices it is open. Not quite dissolving into the din of traffic noise, the sound of grating iron pierces the wind as its locking post had slipped out of its hole in the brick ground. She barely weighs her options in her mind before her feet reflexively lead her through the gate entering the cemetery. Instantly, the street noise diminishes. Drifting along, she can still hear the swinging gate somewhere in the back of her mind. She carries a silent anxiety. The path is paved with stones carrying images and names of last year's tour. In her mind, she reads the names aloud. Few of them carry resemblances to the nameplates of the houses in the area. Others carry an exoticism she'd not sounded before. The third name along her way ends in a Y. Gilly, she intonates. Gilly. Gilly, while briefly inventing an identity of the namesake. Burying the phonetic emphasis in the name's letters, she thinks of fabrics, a textile merchant's family perhaps. She traces the name back somewhere to France. Further on, a stone below a tree reads, Adalbert von Chamisso, poet, botanist, died August 21st, 1838. The stone is square, framed by 4 green pillars connected by a metal chain. A stone owl perches on a pedestal with eyes closed. The stone is cluttered with flowers, wreath bows naming various societies and officials associated with the deceased. She almost fails to connect their presence to an anniversary memorial that may have taken place some days or weeks before. She notices a wooden easel hosting an etching of the man's portrait. She steps in closer to appreciate the portrait, eventually noticing that the supposed fine-etched lines are actually rendered in a pixelated pattern, an irregular skin stretched across the determined but nonetheless serene expression of the poet and botanist. His expression remains unaffected by her critical observation. Indifferent to her presence, he gazes toward the horizon as if studying an approaching weather front recording in his mind the subtle changes in atmosphere. Closing in on his concentrated gaze, she notices the reflection of a window in his iris. She pulls back.
To a high degree, the water in the Bay of San Francisco was phosphorescent of light spots, notably shimmering, a surging wave unfolds on the shoreline beyond the bay. I've studied this water with a microscope and found a low frequency of infusoria that, on the other side, I cannot attribute an important role in the phenomenon. Daily, we are looking at the various formations of the fog the sea breeze carries eastwards over the sunlit land until they dissolve. Remarkably beautiful, the sights they offer on our departure, veiling and unveiling the various peaks of hills in the area.
From the small adjacent promenade, a woman and 3 dogs, 2 chihuahuas and a large mixed breed, approach the row she's been standing in. Slightly timid with enthusiasm, one of the chihuahuas sniffs at her boots. Irritated at the encounter, she manages to step aside and continues to walk westward through several of the cemetery sections divided by stone walls. With less order, blind spots in her memory lodge arbitrary clusters of recollections. A nervous tension inhabits her movement, altering her itinerant pace. Taking in the perspective, she begins to feel constrained within the small labyrinthine architecture of tombstones that lay among her. She recognizes a wall, partly draped in ivy from the tour. It leads towards the southern end of the cemetery, foregrounding a variety of more ostentatious stone memorials. Not following a straight line, the wall tends to leap forward and backward, as though it were designed to architecturally privilege each grave along its path. Towards the end of its trajectory, just before the wall is subsumed into a small crypt, she looks for the little passageway through the wall she'd recalled from her previous visit. But the architecture, foliage, and overgrown ivy have obscured her perspective. As she walks closer towards the wall, she realizes that her memory of the space has failed her, having led her into this unknown portion of the cemetery. Standing between this false memory and her present, she stares blankly at the wall, granting no passage.